Welcome to another edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. There were 18 of us in the Harvard College class of 1963. We are all over 82 years old now, and for the last 4 years we have produced a weekly podcast. Today our guest is Seth Rockman. He is Associate Professor of History at Brown University. Rockman serves on the Faculty Advisory Board of Brown University's Ruth J. Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. His new book is titled Plantation Goods. I'm joined by 15 of my Harvard classmates. All right, so why don't we get started, and we'll start with Alden.
Alden Briscoe, like everybody else, I'm 39 years old. Well, I was born in Mass General, grew up in northwestern Connecticut, and have lived in various places, and now live in the San Francisco Bay Area. My Nigerian brother actually went to Brown in the late 60s.
Fantastic.
Okay, Nick.
You're
muted.
Muted. Okay.
Bancroft. There we go. I guess I exist. Outside of Boston, haven't strayed too far from the nest over time. Peace Corps in India for 2 years with my wife, and keep thinking of caste system versus slavery from time to time, and all its components, kind of like what you're talking about. That's about it.
Okay, John.
John Woodford here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, across the state from where I grew up, and I've been in some kind of writing and editing here and there, but been here for the longest and edited a university publication here, but I've been retired for 20 years. It feels better every day.
David Allen.
Also, this one didn't fall very far from the nest either. Concord, Mass. I've had a mixed life, would be one way to put it. Another is a pastiche. After military, Army infantry officer during the Vietnam era, which was one of the dumbest things I've ever done, but also I'm extremely proud of it. About a decade in business, starting companies, then a stint, another decade or so in the academic world. And when the program I started at the Kennedy School got killed by internecine academic struggle there, these later decades have been activism in one way or another, and so pleased that Kent has made this all happen.
All right, and Elizabeth.
Hi, I haven't been here for some time, but I'm also Radcliffe 63, and very excited about being with the group, and very, very grateful to Kent. I'm a native Californian, and I'm also very proud of being a native Californian. And I've lived in Washington, D.C. since 2006. Both of my children retired from the Foreign Service in 2022. And my daughter-in-law, unfortunately, is very high up in an organization that's almost fully funded by USAID. So we're not too happy here in Washington. Well, I'm in Maryland, and also very interested in exploring the fact that I come from an enslaving family in Charlottesville, and have been very interested in pursuing that.
Okay, Richard Rothstein.
There, of course, class of 63. I'm a jack of some trades, so the master of none. I split my time between Cape Cod and Berkeley. I was continuing to work until um, January 20th, and now I can't figure out what to do until we have a general strike. But
Jerry.
Jerry Secundi. I'm lucky enough to be up at Lake Arrowhead, one of the few places that hasn't burned down yet in California. So I'm enjoying it while I can. And class of 63, environmental lawyer, Peace Corps in Cusco, Peru. First job was with the Department of Justice under Nixon. And I thought things were bad then. Nothing compared to today.
George Jones.
George Jones, also in Ann Arbor, Michigan, class of 63. My daughter graduated from Brown, had a terrific time there, according to her. And at least one member of this group suggested that she went to Brown because she wasn't good enough to get into Harvard.
Marcy.
I was not the one who made that suggestion.
Marcy.
I run a nonprofit in New York City that supports wiser allocation of public resources, disaster prevention, and the preservation of invaluable archives.
Okay.
In back of you.
I always get to you last because you're in Italy. You're the furthest away, I guess.
Yeah, I get the distance prize, I think. Yeah, I'm, let's see, Radcliffe 63, and then 2 years in the Peace Corps in Turkey. Then I got a master's at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard. Then from then on, I've lived in Italy and been a jack of many trades, doing a lot of different things. None of them distinguished. I had a very undistinguished career. And now, yeah.
Hey, David Othmer.
Okay, can you hear me now?
David, yes, we hear you.
Good. David Othmer, I came to Harvard from Rio de Janeiro, and I'm still trying to figure out why in the world I did that. but
He's my roommate, but he was never very bright. So.
I spent most of my career with public broadcasting in New York and in Philadelphia, and now we're retired in Philadelphia.
Okay, and Hamp.
Yeah, Hampton Howell, class of 63, still working clinical psychologist, and spent 2 frantic hours this morning trying to sort through 23andMe stuff for my daughter while they're going bankrupt.
Jeez.
Right. And so welcome, Seth, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
About yourself, your life, and the book.
All right. No, this is great. And I mean, it's wonderful to see how Zoom has made possible for these kinds of communities to congeal and for longtime friendships to remain alive. I think this might be the only good thing that came out of COVID was the idea that we could use these kinds of spaces to meet. And my high school friends and my college friends have done something quite similar. And it really is a joy to see all of you here today and to know how this group has come together in recent years and what its meaning has been for all of you. So thanks for having me here. So I'm talking to you today from Providence, Rhode Island, where I have lived for the last 20 some years, and it's the longest place that I've ever lived.
You should get on this.
I'll tell you a little bit. I guess I'll give you a bit at Ken's urging, a bit of biography, and then I'll tell you about this book that I've recently published that might be of interest for all the folks who are thinking about the ways in which New England's history has been tied up with the history of slavery and the way in which the kinds of dilemmas that organize so much of our present lives around things like ethical consumption under capitalism have much longer histories in the American past. So I had the good fortune to be born in Bloomington, Indiana, where my parents, who are class of 64 people, so babies, I suppose, relatively speaking,
Mhm.
by 1 year. Were both pursuing graduate degrees in the 1960s. And I had a very nice Midwestern upbringing in Bloomington, a perfect college town to be a kid. And then when I was 12, in a move of utter genius, my parents moved us to San Francisco. And truly one of the best things that could happen to a young person. And so I went to some of middle school and high school in the city. And that really became a very important part of who I am and what I am. I attended San Francisco's sort of public magnet high school, Lowell High School, a large school of some 3,200 students. I'm glad, Alden, that this resonates. This is good to see. Oh, you're
You're
muted,
muted.
unfortunately.
We consult with nonprofits. We were asked to talk to the Lowell Alumni Association about raising funds, and then when it became no longer elite school, that ended. So
Yeah, it's the San Francisco Unified School District has many sort of gone back and forth in recent years about whether it is appropriate to have a test in high school or whether or not it should move simply to a lottery system. It has been sued many times by Asian and Asian American parents associations in terms of what its demography looks like and the way in which the test has worked against Asian and Asian American students. And at the time, it was a school, when I went there, it was a school about 68, 69% Asian American students. And it was an amazing incubator of super smart people who went on to do pretty amazing things. And I'm thoroughly grateful for the time there. But then, because I think like many young people, I needed to get at least 3,000 miles away from my parents. I went to college in New York City. I attended Columbia University. That was largely motivated by my desire to read those books within the Western Civ canon. At that time, it just seemed to me that that was a really important thing to have under one's belt, and I had a great experience at Columbia. But that was also the place where I came to recognize the stakes of US history and being in classes with people like Eric Foner and Barbara Fields and Betsy Blackmar, some of the truly amazing US historians at Columbia at that time. I came to recognize that there was a politics to this history and that questions about sort of how race and democracy have intersected with one another in the American past are crucial questions for why the world looks the way it does in the present. And I knew very quickly from taking classes with those amazing scholars that that's the kind of work I wanted to do. Graduating college, I couldn't think of much else to do, but I heard about this thing called graduate school, where like they would give you money to take classes and get a degree. And so that seemed like a good thing to do for want of anything else. And at that time, I thought, well, I've lived in New York for 4 years. Don't people know they could live in California? Don't people know about this magical place where it's nice? And so I only applied to graduate schools in California and ended up getting my PhD at UC Davis.
Oh,
Davis is
wow.
a somewhat off the beaten path kind of place. It's
Yeah.
closer to Sacramento than it is to Oakland or San Francisco, but it's only an hour and 10 minutes out of San Francisco. And it's this beautiful college town where everyone rides bikes and no one is in a hurry. And it was just a wonderful place to be a doctoral student. Among other things, there wasn't that much else to do but study. Um, and so another really nice thing that happened to me while I was a graduate student there was my second year. They had hired a new American historian, a guy named Alan Taylor. And I didn't know much about him, but he quickly became my doctoral advisor. And that year he won the Pulitzer Prize for a book called William Cooperstown, a story of the father of James Fenimore Cooper and sort of land development and speculation and dispossession in New York State. And he went on to have a really robust career. He won a second Pulitzer Prize for a book in the 20 teens, and he's published numerous other books. And he was a very, very good advisor for me. And that was also quite formative. Coming out of graduate school, I ended up getting a job in Los Angeles at Occidental College. And this was also a tremendous revelation to me as someone who was a Northern California, snob. And why would anyone go to Southern California? What possibly good could that be?
Oh, great.
And right, and then I showed up at Occidental College, and I was like, "This is the most beautiful campus ever, and what a wonderful place!" And here, east of downtown, between Glendale and Pasadena, you had an LA that was not like the LA of the caricatured, screenwriters and coffee shops, and everyone worrying about their most recent plastic surgery. But a place of real people and real families with a long history. And I truly, truly came to love that part of Los Angeles. Eventually, when my wife and I were married in 2001, we got married in downtown Los Angeles in front of the public library. And that place remains a place that is very close to my heart. But then, having married someone I met in graduate school who also had a very successful academic career, something quite remarkable happened in 2001, which is she got this job at Brown University, sort of out of the blue. And all of a sudden, we were confronted with what is a fairly standard problem in academia, the so-called two-body problem, institutions on opposite coasts. My wife is also a history professor. She works in European history and history of science, so we don't read the same books or study the same things. But clearly we had to work this out. And it took a couple of years, including the opportunity for her to take a job in Los Angeles. But then an opportunity opened up for me to take a job at Brown. And so we passed our lot with New England. Both of my wife, a California native, in fact, neither one of us had any experience with New England. We're quite surprised that this is where we would end up. And now, 20 some years in, it's hard to imagine living anywhere else. It's very, very easy here. And I think Rhode Island in particular, as a small state where you drive 20 minutes and you're at the water, a place that is small enough that you can know your Congress people, you can know your city council people, you can know your senators because you bump into them at the grocery store. This is a state of 1 million people, and it's a very good place to live in the spirit of sort of small d democracy. And I've come to love that. I've also come to love it because I get to walk to work. And I've come to love it because I don't feel that nature is trying to kill me most of the time. And so, with all due respect to my friends in California here, and I'm there quite often because my parents still live in San Francisco, I don't feel particularly good about fires and smoke and mudslides and Arctic rivers and the many other things that seem to be making life in California more difficult than easy. So here we are, living in New England. I came to Brown University right at the moment that our president, Ruth Simmons, was starting what was then called the Slavery and Justice Initiative. And I don't know how many of you know that history. I'm guessing it's somewhat familiar, but President Simmons was the first Black president of an Ivy League university, and President Simmons came into office right at the moment that people like Charles Ogletree were beginning to talk about schools like Brown as possible defendants in a reparations lawsuit. Looking for any kind of legacy institution, Brown's name came up quite frequently based on the question of where the four Brown brothers, after the school was named, where they got their money. And President Simmons said, look, rather than having this come out in court under an adversarial process of discovery, we should do what universities do really well. We should, devote academic resources to truth-telling and to finding out what actually happened. So, as someone who had trained in 18th and early 19th century histories of capitalism, more or less, I was very well positioned to help jump in and start doing the kind of forensic work into the Brown family business records to figure out where they got their money. And so my first couple of years on campus were spent working closely with colleagues who were formerly on the Slavery and Justice Committee, including my closest colleague then, a man named Jim Campbell, who was the chair of that committee and who presently is on the faculty of Stanford. But we worked a great deal to figure out how these guys got their money in the middle of the 18th century. And it turns out they did not make their money slave trading. In fact, every time they sent a voyage to West Africa to buy enslaved people, they lost money. Now, this would not be particularly exculpatory, right? Oh, they were just bad at it. They tried really hard, but they just weren't very good at it. So, no harm, no foul. Obviously, that was not the case at all. But what we did figure out is that the Brown brothers, like so many other New England merchant families in the 18th century, made a huge amount of money through the provisioning trade. Places like Rhode Island and even places like Massachusetts were basically colonies of the colonies that truly mattered in the British Empire in the 18th century. And those were the slave islands in the Caribbean producing sugar, the world's most valuable export commodity at that moment in time. And so Rhode Island merchants like the Browns gathered up salt cod, they gathered up horses, they gathered up cheese and onions and grain, and they sent all of these things to Barbados and to Jamaica to feed enslaved workers on sugar plantations. In turn, they were often paid with this industrial byproduct of sugar refinement, that is to say, sludgy, dark molasses, which they brought back to New England and distilled into rum, and then sold that rum to other merchants who often brought that rum to places like West Africa to purchase more slaves who would then be delivered to places like Barbados and Jamaica, keeping the cycle going and going and going. So that work was crucially important to sort of the kinds of questions I wanted to ask as a historian, primarily because the story that the Slavery and Justice Report told when it was finished in 2006 was basically, look, the people like the Browns made a lot of money in this provisioning trade, and they were tied into the Atlantic slave trade, of course. But in 1808, when that was abolished by the US government under the provisions of the Constitution, they quickly pivoted to other kinds of enterprises, and New England was on its way towards being the place that we know it through the stories we so often tell around the Civil War, the place of abolitionism and the place of do-gooders and the place of freedom and wage labor and factories and all this kind of stuff. And the story seemed really neat. So what I wanted to do then was to sort of figure out the next phase of Rhode Island and more broadly New England's relationship to slavery in the 19th century, recognizing that I didn't think it was in fact done. And obviously, if we think about places like Lowell and the mills and New England's cotton economy, we would have to say, well, where'd that cotton come from? It wasn't coming from Vermont. And indeed, there was no way for the entire New England textile complex to source cotton anywhere else but from the slave plantations of the US South. And so New England's relationship to slavery would then remain incredibly robust since slave labor provided them with the crucial input to their industrial revolution. But I wanted to do something that was going to be a little bit different than that. And I wanted to think about this provisioning trade, right? The 18th century Brown brothers had done so much in the provisioning trade to Jamaica and Barbados with foodstuff. But what about when New England began undergoing an industrial revolution in the 19th century? How did they, provision slave plantations? And with that question, I began to stumble into a number of small communities scattered throughout Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts, where virtually every family was involved somehow in making shoes or making hats or making axes and shovels and hoes, or weaving and then sewing textiles for enslaved people to wear. And so I ended up focusing in the book I recently published on a category of things that were called in the 19th century plantation goods. And that term plantation goods would have been known to Americans North and South, black and white, enslaved and free, referring to that set of things that were necessary to run a plantation. right? You needed axes, you needed hoes, you needed shoes, you needed hats. And New England manufacturers found a tremendous opportunity to sort of cut their teeth in low quality manufacturing for an American market that had a voracious appetite for these goods, but had very little interest in goods that were better made. The slave plantations in the United States were interested in cheap goods that were functional but not particularly well made. And that was a great entry point for a New England industrial sector that was just finding its footing. Entrepreneurs here in New England found ways of connecting the lives and livelihoods of people in their community to the lives and livelihoods of an increasing number of enslaved men and women who found themselves on newly opened cotton plantations in lands that had just recently been part of indigenous nations in places like Alabama and Mississippi, but which by the 20 teens and 2020s had been seized by the United States and quickly converted into some of the most productive and profitable cotton and sugar plantations in the entire Western Hemisphere. And so New Englanders sort of rushed into this void and they began developing products and marketing products to slaveholders as being made especially useful for their market, for their workers. And so they did a lot of what I would call research and development. That is to say, they sent agents traveling from Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island to Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana to talk to slaveholders and to talk to enslaved people and to talk to merchants about what were the most desirable kinds of fabrics, what were the necessary tools, what should the shoes look like. And this information was conveyed back to New England and put people to work in communities like, say, North Brookfield, Massachusetts, a little place about 20 miles to the west of Worcester that was the slave shoe capital of the United States, or a little town in the southern part of Rhode Island called South Kingstown, which is today where the University of Rhode Island is located, which became the leading site in the manufacture of woolen cloth for plantation markets, and that was marketed under the fairly distressing but informative term Negro cloth as a textile explicitly intended for enslaved people to wear. Now, it's important to remember that there was nothing actually special about this cloth, right? The same cloth could be sent to upstate New York to dress canal diggers. It could be sent to Illinois to dress farmers. It could be sent to New Bedford to dress sailors on whale ships. But when this woolen cloth was sent to Charleston or sent to Savannah or sent to Mobile, it was marketed as especially designed for slaves to use. And in fact, it wasn't just the label Negro cloth that was put on it. There was a whole set of discussions like, oh, no, 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 because it's wool, it actually wicks moisture off of bodies and keeps people healthy. Because it's wool, it won't tear against the stems of the cotton plants and will protect people from being having their skin torn during their field labor. Because it's twill woven and because it's again made of wool, it will felt and it will move, which will allow your workers to move more agilely through the rows of a cotton field. All of this kind of apparatus was affixed to a fairly generic kind of low quality woolen cloth that made it seem as though the New Englanders were working hard to make slaveholders more productive and more profit by keeping enslaved people more working more quickly and with greater degrees of health. And so in this book, I try to track these goods, axes and shovels and machetes from these small communities in New England where they're made to plantation spaces where they're used and talk about all the different kinds of things that happen as they move through different hands. So I start with these New England entrepreneurs who are like, hey, if I could make an indestructible hoe, I would be a millionaire. How do you do that? And they try all sorts of things to do this. They develop some incredible new machinery. They seek patent protection. It's really not a fairly straightforward thing, and they try to sort of crack this nut of how to enter the Southern market. I then talk about Northern workers, both women who are doing a great deal of weaving and sewing, and men who are working in iron mills to make tools, and how they negotiated the transition to capitalism and the rise of wage labor through these goods that they're making for other American workers, and what it might mean, for example, for a strike at a New England iron factory for people to say, we will not be wage slaves, when in fact everyone knows that they're spending their days making hoes and shovels for actual slaves. I spent a couple chapters in the middle of the book talking about the middlemen, the merchants, and the creditors and the advertisers who are crucial in knitting together the North and South and the national market around these things, and who tell a great number of stories about these goods in order to make these markets. And then finally, I spent a couple chapters talking about slaveholders and the kinds of fantasies that they have around these goods, about how these goods are part of their desire to be masters, and about how their own honor is caught up in the goods that they distribute to their people, and the ways in which they use these goods in schemes of punishment, of schemes of reward, and ultimately to fend off the critique of Northern abolitionists that the plantation is a site of tremendous poverty. Slaveholders use these goods to say, you want poverty? Look in New York City, look in Boston, but look at how well our people are dressed. And so these goods have a really crucial role in their own sort of self-presentation. And then the final chapters of the book are about enslaved people themselves and the ways in which enslaved people use Northern textiles and Northern tools in their own political strategies, in their own self-presentation, in their own production of a material culture, and the work that is so often involved in taking New England-made cloth and converting it into dresses and jackets and pants for people to wear by enslaved seamstresses, or to make shoes that are made in New England and don't fit particularly well, to modify them so that they can actually help a man travel through the woods at night to go visit his wife on a neighboring plantation. And so, again, starting in communities where things are made, ending up in communities where things are used, by following these things from point A to point B, I can tell virtually the entire story of 19th century American history, which then ultimately culminates in a civil war in which many of these northern firms don't feel particularly bad about the end of slavery because they have a very soft landing. Because the same factory that's making boots in Massachusetts for slaves in 1859 is making boots for the Union infantry in 1861. Cloth that had been marketed as Negro cloth in 1860 would be basically Union enlisted men's pants in 1861. And so the government, in some ways, subsidizes their departure from this market. And on the other side of the Civil War, many of these firms are larger than they've ever been and move into other kinds of segments of production very much in accordance with their vision, which is to start out by making low quality goods for consumers who they don't really care about. And once they have the capital and once they have the technology, to move into more lucrative markets. And that's largely where this story ends. So that's the book. It's called Plantation Goods. It came out in November from University of Chicago Press. It's written for normal human beings to read rather than for highly specialized academic audiences. And I'm happy to tell you more about the book or tell you more about other things, whatever you'd like to discuss in the time we have left.
John. Well, one thing I'd like to know is, I'm going to get the book because the first chapter I could read was online, and it's about such detail on the production of these various useful objects, the axes and the hose. I mean, the research you had to do to cover the history of commodities, of the commodity itself, is just it's fascinating. Plus, the language is mighty striking. I mean, a lot of it's almost like poetry in a way, But some of the things you quote, but also you yourself are quite a writer. But I wanted to say about Ruth Simmons because we've been trying. We wish we could get her on here because her autobiography, I think it's called Up Home.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anyone else has read it. It's one of the most wonderful autobiographies of someone growing up at the same time as we did, but her in Texas. She growing up in Texas. And if we could get her on here, that would be great because it's a real masterpiece of an autobiography.
It's a fantastic book. You know where sometimes you can find Ruth Simmons if you're looking for a way of contacting her, and
Uh-huh.
this is surprising to me. LinkedIn.
Oh,
She's actually on LinkedIn of all places.
huh. I see. I never have used it because I never, well, I'm not good at that stuff, but it was almost like an annoyance.
Sure.
Oh, but I didn't know if people were really on it or not.
It's not that hard.
Ah, let's do it. Anyway,
But
David,
no, it is a beautiful book,
yeah.
Up Home, and her story is truly compelling. But thank you, John, too, for the kind words about Plantation Goods and its writing and its research. It took a long time. This was a book about 18 years in the making.
Mm,
There were a good number of interruptions along the way. But I'll just say one quick thing about it that ended up being most surprising to me in terms of the level of detail I was able to get is that a lot of these northern companies that were specializing in plantation goods have enormous archives, some of the best collections that I've ever seen, and they're all here in New England. And so this is a strange thing. If you were trying to write about what life was like in Alabama in 1840, you would be unlikely to come to the Rhode Island Historical Society. You would be unlikely to go to the Baker Library at Harvard Business School. These are not places you would expect to find this kind of material.
mhm.
But these archives of these firms have literally thousands of letters from slaveholders, from merchants, from company agents, from plantation to plantation salesmen, writing about. I talked to the slaves, I talked to the men on this plantation. They said this. I talked to Colonel so and so. He said that. And so all this information is coming back into the New England Archive, and it really you could spend a lifetime just reading the papers of this particular firm in Rhode Island called the Hazard family and the Peacedale Manufacturing Company, with records at Baker Library, at Harvard Business School, with records at the Rhode Island Historical Society, and records at like another 12 repositories throughout New England. It really is remarkable.
Mm.
David, Alan.
18 years, that surely speaks to how and why this is so bloody rich and such a delight to listen to. Wow. And so many intriguing pieces of it. We want to know, to hear that the slaveholders had honor and they had to protect that honor. Well, of course, we're not surprised. I suppose they did amount of war, but that's not always about honor. Um, Beyond that, uh, the way that New England apparently had some dominant position in this, were other places supplying these, or did New England really have a lock, not a monopoly, but was it really the center? And I suppose when we look at Lowell and the mills and so forth, that could well be. But finally, and most of all, and of course you'll pick up on whichever one of these you think is worth going to, uh, New England commerce and industry building itself fundamentally on slaveholding. Let's just say it out loud there, plain and simple. Sliding because the government needed much of what was there for the war, and then after that, being able to shrewdly build, as you point out, having accumulated capital and now could go up market. Uh, that's got a tale that most people in New England don't think about, that it started out with basically dependence on slaveholding. But you'll know which of those things.
No, those are all good observations to make. I'll start in the middle one, which is that New England was desperately trying to enter this market in order to displace British imports.
Right.
The British Industrial Revolution was a good 50 years ahead, and Britain was providing most of the goods that American plantations were using, of course, from the colonial period, but into the period of American independence. And for many Americans, particularly around the War of 1812, there was some notion that we couldn't be politically independent while we were so economically independent. or economically dependent. And so the idea was that American manufacturing should try to move into this sector. And of course, there was a great deal of tariff protection that went towards this sector in the late 18 teens and early 1820s, culminating in the very famous tariffs that Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun fought about in 1828 all the way up till nullification in 1831, 32, and 33. So the tariff is a big part of this story. And it turns out if you go back and read the tariff debates, like congressional floor speeches and all this kind of stuff, they don't usually say it explicitly, but every once in a while, someone will say it, usually some representative from Massachusetts, like, oh, so basically this is about who's going to dress the slaves. And then the representative from South Carolina will say, how dare you impugn our honor? This is, and then it sort of dies down. But the term Negro cloth, for example, enters into those tariff debates periodically, although usually it's under the euphemism coarse woolens. But if you read through those debates and see the word coarse woolens every time it shows up and you think, oh, that actually means Negro cloth, you recognize how much of their energy is being spent determining whether or not New England weavers or Welsh weavers are going to be dressing the American slaves. On the first issue around honor, I mean, slaveholders have developed this culture for themselves. They're competitive with one another. And this is one of those places where I'm able to talk about how enslaved people can turn this back on the people who claim to own them. Right. In many ways, enslaved people know slaveholders better than slaveholders know themselves. So if you can imagine a situation in which an enslaved man says to the person who claims to own him, hey, I was just over at the neighboring plantation and they all got new shoes last week. They look pretty good. Colonel Smith must be doing pretty good. He must be having some pretty flush times over there. Right. You inject that piece of information into that with someone who's like, I'm better than Colonel, and next thing you know, sort of this competitive white male honor culture leads you to getting better shoes. And I think there are lots of different ways in which enslaved people find ways of tweaking the self-perception that slaveholders often have, or through talking about these kinds of goods. And that's an interesting dynamic. But ultimately, David, your question about, or your point that simply this changes the way New England thinks about its history. That's sort of the goal here, and to recognize that we can still tell stories about industrial development and an industrial revolution based on all sorts of really remarkable inventors and tinkerers and a kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem that makes New England in the 18 teens and 1820s look a lot like Silicon Valley, right? It is the Silicon Valley of its day. But to say that the problem that people like, Eli Whitney and Eli Terry and Samuel Bigelow and so many of these other New England inventors are trying to solve are not simply the problems of how to make, an interchangeable part for this or how to mechanize that, but how to make a hoe that slaves can't break. And that's also part of the kind of, process of New England's industrial development. And I'd like to get that story better known.
Richard.
Yeah, thanks. Seth, you said that this pretty much ended at the Civil War and they shifted sales to Northern industrial workers. But most of the freed slaves continued to work on the same plantations as sharecroppers and serfs. So how did they manage to provision themselves after that if the northern manufacturers were no longer shipping Negro cloth down?
No, it's a very good point you make, and it's not that they leave that market entirely. It's just that they have aspirations for better markets, and more upstart manufacturers begin to move into those markets. Actually, the book ends with a whole set of conversations in the middle of the Civil War about how great emancipation is going to be for Northern industry. And indeed, the term that comes up again and again is 4 million emancipated consumers. That once formerly enslaved people are going to have their own money to spend, they're going to spend much more of it, and they're going to make more consumer choices, and this will be a boon for New England manufacturers. Of course, it ends up being the case, the violence of Reconstruction and the terrible conditions of debt peonage that emerge and come to dominate the sharecropping system means that, in fact, formerly enslaved people don't have a lot of spending money. They don't have a lot of disposable income, and that market doesn't pan out in the same kind of way because those kinds of goods don't end up being sort of part of the consumer experience, if you will, of enslaved people in the same
I
way.
see.
I wanted to really focus this book much more on tools and shoes and hats and clothing, recognizing that the people who were using those goods on a daily basis may have created all sorts of arguments about them or relationships to those goods in ways that might be more difficult to a large piece of machinery like a cotton gin. So it is very important, and it is another important way of New England's connection to this. There's a place, just if we want to talk about Connecticut real quick, there's a place about just to the west of Hartford called Collinsville, Connecticut. And Collinsville, Connecticut is the home of the Collinsville Manufacturing Company, which made the leading axe that enslaved woodsmen would have used to cut down the forest in order to make slave plantations through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and then into Arkansas. But they also, in 1850 something, got an order from a Cuban sugar planter saying, hey, can you make us a machete? And we'd like the blade to be angled like this, and we'd like the handle to be like this. And they create a prototype and they send it back, and then they make another one. And they end up creating the sort of the industry standard sugarcane machete. So much so that into the 20th century, I was told that if you went into a hardware store in Latin America and went up to the counter and asked for El Colines, someone would simply hand you a machete. That Collins became like the Kleenex or the Xerox of sugarcane machetes in terms of the market share that they held, which is quite remarkable.
And nobody thought La Colline was a hill, which
you talk about the different quality of axes from Europe and competitive axes. Who was making the best axes?
Well, the Collins Company for sure. I mean, they had the best technicians. They had more patents on machinery than virtually anyone else. And merchants basically said if it can't compete with the Collins, it has no chance. And if it's not a Collins, it has no chance. And of course, there are many people who are trying to knock them off and create counterfeit ones, and sometimes even stamp tools with fake trademarks. And so there's a lot of scheming involved in this business.
Seth, this is Jerry. Couple things. First, I live in Pasadena, and I'm so sorry you went down the dark path and deserted California. So that is a jewel, is all I can say, and it's
of course
still extant. So my mother, who was born in 1913, was the granddaughter of a freed slave, and I don't believe she inherited any Negro cloth, but I would be very curious. The reason I bring that up is, do you have examples of the cloths, of the shoes, of the axes? Are they in a museum somewhere? Are they in the Smithsonian Museum, for example? I've been to the Museum of the Confederacy, and they have all of the uniforms and costumes of people that wore them back during the Civil War. So is there something like that where we could see these things?
It's a wonderful question, and it is one of the great challenges of writing a book about material culture where there's not a lot of remaining or surviving material culture. You know, about 12 years or so ago when, maybe it was a little bit more than that, when Lonnie Bunch, who was then, the inaugural director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, was asked what he was looking for the collections, he said, the thing I would most like to find and that I'm least likely to find is everyday work clothing for enslaved people. It just doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist because, of course, it's meant to be used up. And for people living in desperate poverty, it was used up, right? When clothing was in shreds, it might be torn into bandages. It might be made into patches. It might be stuffed into toes of shoes for insulation. And then, of course, this was not the kind of stuff that museums or heritage societies were particularly interested in collecting at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century because of their sort of notion that this is not relevant or useful or historically significant whatsoever. So we don't have a particularly robust set of materials. The same applies to shoes. The same applies to many of the tools as well. So there are a couple things that emerged here. I mean, one is that with the textiles, some of the most robust evidence comes not from surviving garments, but from 2 inch by 2 inch squares that are straight pinned onto business correspondence in the form of samples. So a letter from a slaveholder to New England saying, "This is what I got last year. Can you make me 500 yards of this?" Or a letter from a New England merchant to a Charleston merchant, or a New England manufacturer to a Charleston merchant saying, "This is what we're doing this year. Do you want 1,000 yards or 2,000 yards?" And so I was able to use a lot of those samples to talk about the very, very precise nature of this cloth, right? In terms of how many warp ends um, per yard, or how many twill woven versus plain woven, or weight per yard, or any number of the other kinds of characteristics that would make some cloth more durable than other cloth. And at some point, I took some of these records from labor contracts to a place called the Marshfield School of Weaving in Vermont, and worked with them to reconstruct some of this fabric. And I learned how to weave as part of the research project process here, and that was very edifying as well. As someone who had no textile experience, they had to explain everything to me like I was a total idiot, because I was. And so all the kind of tacit knowledge that goes into making, that anyone who's spent time at a potter's wheel or anyone who's spent time at a sewing machine would just know, because you just do it. This is just how it is. They had to explain it to me. And that brought a lot of insight into the kinds of decisions that, say, a New England weaver in the 1820s might have had to make in terms of going fast, going slow, cleaning up errors or letting errors go, things of that sort. But to wrap up this question, Jerry, there are a few surviving shoes, there are some remaining tools, but they're few and far between, and they're not gathered in any central place. So the images that I have in the book are some of the best images of what these shoes might have looked like, or what some of these textiles might have looked like.
I just want to interject one thing. I kept putting up my hand, but for some reason the Zoom didn't register it. I was at NMAH AAHC about 3 weeks ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I don't know whether it was a actual exemplar or whether it was just a reproduction, but I believe in the room where the Thomas Jefferson information is, that there is, I think, a mannequin dressed there. And I think that they talk about Negro cloth in that particular room. Again, that's my memory, but I just wanted to put that in.
Yeah, I would imagine that that's probably reconstruction rather than an original garment. And what does survive, right, tends to be clothing like a livery suit for a carriage driver,
Mm.
or the dress for someone who is doing domestic service in a fancy home. But as you move sort of further down into the experience of field hands and people doing agricultural labor, there's much less stuff that survives.
One other question I have. I grew up in northwestern Connecticut, and that's where the iron industry was. In Salisbury and so on. I suspect much of the iron that is used in hose and other metal probably came from Salisbury, but I don't know. Do you happen to know? Do
Well,
the
so
colonists?
the sort of the supply chain for iron itself, it's coming from lots of different places, and this also has to do with sort of tariff protection, to be honest, right? There's all sorts of discussion about whether imported Swedish iron will make for better tools for plantation markets versus iron that's being brought up from Pennsylvania, or that might be coming from Western Connecticut. So it really varies, and I think that some of the manufacturers might have been experimenting with different kinds of iron in axes versus shovels versus hoes versus machetes. The supply chain on wool is also very interesting here. I'll just mention to you, most of the wool that ends up being used to make textiles for plantation markets is being imported into the United States, either from Buenos Aires, so from Argentina, or from the Eastern Mediterranean through the port of Smyrna coming out of the Ottoman Empire.
Oh,
So
for heaven's sakes. Wow.
if we're thinking about sort of a global supply chain here and how we tell stories that might bring together the life of a New England weaver and a Mississippi field worker, we also now need sort of an Argentine goat herder or an Ottoman sheep rancher. And again, really, I think compelling evidence of sort of this globalized world.
Amazing.
I don't know how close we are to an end, but before we go, I want to note I grew up on a farm about a dozen miles out of New Albany, about 60 miles south of Bloomington.
Uh-huh.
I spent a few more years there than you did before I got plucked out, of course.
I think where I learned about Negro cloth was in the book All That She Carried.
That's right.
Yeah, there's a beautiful chapter there where she talks about that.
Yeah, if people haven't spent time with Taya Miles's book, it really is quite a moving and beautiful meditation on the material culture of slavery and on the ties of mothers and daughters and memory. It's really one of the best things to come out on these questions in recent years, and I'm very, very appreciative of that work.
Yeah. So I guess one question that we can ask is what's next for you, or what are you working on currently?
Yeah. So I have taken on what might be a fool's errand, or might be the book of a lifetime. We'll see. I'm writing a book about the United States from pretty much the 1760s, so before it's the United States, all the way to the 1840s, and it's a volume that will appear in the Penguin History of the United States, which is a 5-volume account of this nation's history. And there's a book called American Colonies, that's volume 1. There's a book called A Nation Without Borders by a historian at NYU named Stephen Hahn, that's volume 3. And this is going to be volume 2. So to figure out sort of the American Revolution and the early Republic, and to put that together in 400 pages without footnotes in a rollicking narrative that captures readers who buy books in American airports is going to be a great challenge. I think the hardest part is going to be writing without footnotes, frankly, because that is so temperamentally foreign to me. But that's what I'm up to. And it's a book that is going to talk a lot about sort of economic sovereignty versus political sovereignty, about a United States that declares its political independence long before it has much of its own economic independence. And that's largely because of its reliance on cotton exports to places like Britain for almost all of the capital that comes into the United States, and the fact that it doesn't have its own sources of gold and silver. And really not until the California gold rush does the United States have a reliable source of its own specie that allows it to have a kind of financial sovereignty that otherwise it's lacking. And I want to use these questions to sort of tell a bigger story about the new American nation as a developing nation, as a place that is desperate for foreign capital and is seeking to be attractive to foreign capital. And then figure out how that matters in the lives of ordinary people. Because at the end of the day, I think my commitments are as a social historian to writing about how people who are workers and people who are on the margins experience these large dynamics of history. So that's what I'm up to. Kent, welcome back.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank heavens.
Thought it's snowing up here and my
Wow.
phone went out or something. So I'm back. Thank you.
Okay.
Great.
Well, we could recap all the topics that we spoke about, but there were many great questions, and I was really happy to get to share some of this with your group.
And so I will edit the recording, and I can get a chance to look at it later, as we all can.
We're putting money on you for your next book. We're sure it's going to be great.
Thank you.
Oh, great.
Take care.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Wonderful to spend lunchtime with you. Have a great day.
Okay.
Very, very helpful.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Seth Rockman. He is an associate professor at Brown University, and his new book is titled Plantation Goods. And that's it for this edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. Talk to you next week. I'm Kent Garrett.